Chapter 44, The Aborigines, Section 3. It would be useful to mankind to trace the causes which led to that long and disastrous conflict in which so many lives were sacrificed and a people, all but a fading fragment, became extinct. Among those mentioned by the government was the admission into the colony of Sydney blacks and the ascendancy which one of them acquired. The emigrants of 1822 remember a number of natives who roamed about the district and were known as the tame mob. They were absconders from different tribes and separated from their chiefs. They often entered the town and obtained bread, tobacco, and even rum from the inhabitants. Their importunity was troublesome and their appearance offensive. The eruptive disease which covered their skin, especially on the legs, most exposed to the heat of their fires, added to their squalor and wretchedness. They are thus described by the Rev. Mr. Horton. He saw them at Pittwater, crouching round their fires and entirely naked, a company of demoralized savages. Mosquito became their head. He was transported from Sydney to this colony for the murder of a woman. For some time he acted as a stock-keeper. He was then employed as a guide in tracking the bushrangers, having the keenness of vision and almost canine instinct, by which in the slightest traces he discovered a certain clue. For this service, it is said, he was promised restoration to his country. A promise unhappily forgotten. He was odious to the prisoners who taunted him as a nose for the hangman. His resentful nature could not brook the insult, and he struck down a convict who thus reviled him. He was then taken into custody. In alarm, he escaped to the bush. The muscular strength and superior skill of this man were supposed to have recommended him to the natives as their chief. He was seen, by Robertson, to cut off the head of a pigeon with a stick while flying. Mosquito answered Mr. Horton with intelligence. When that gentleman represented the misery of a vagrant life, he said that he should prefer to live like the white man, tilling the ground, but that none of his companions would join him. Before he united with the natives, he was accustomed to pursuing them with all the virulence of a savage. In company with a convict servant, he would face the darkness and go out to storm the huts he had seen in the day. On one such occasion, in spite of prohibitions, he set out at night, but the natives had observed him and decamped, leaving behind them large fires to deceive their enemy. Returning at midnight, he was mistaken for a Tasmanian black, and but for discovery at the moment would have suffered the fate he deserved. It was said by Mr. G. Robertson that the first murders of Mosquito were committed in self-defense. He associated with the Oyster Bay tribe, and his power over them was great. He even prevailed on them to perform some rude agricultural labor. He had high notions of his own worth. He would stalk into the cottages of the settlers, seat himself with great dignity. His followers, to the number of 100 or 200, patiently awaiting his signal to approach. As the influence of Mosquito enlarged, it became more pernicious. He not only misled his immediate followers, but propagated his spirit. Deeds of great enormity were committed at his direction, several by his own hand. He drew a man from his house at Pittwater by the cooey and then speared him to death. A servant of Mr. Cassidy and another of Mr. Evans met a similar fate. In concert with Tom, a Tasmanian black, he became a terror to the colony. Their parties moved in large bodies and acted under a common impulse. In carrying on their depredations, their tactics aimed at military unity and skill. A party of 60 appeared before the premises of Mr. Hobbs at the Eastern Marshes in 1824. They watched the servants deliver their fire, and before they could reload their muskets, they rushed upon them, and by weight of numbers drove them off the ground. A few days after, the natives again appeared. A small party came forward first and reconnoitred. Then, returning to a hill, they made signals to a body of 150 in an opposite direction. Both divisions bore down on the establishment. The English were now well armed and maintained the post for 5 hours, but escaped when they saw the natives prepare to surround the dwelling with fire. Overcome with terror, for several days they refused to return, and the property was left to its fate. Mr. Hobbs was especially unfortunate. His house lay in the track, both of the natives and bushrangers, and thrice in one season his premises were pillaged. The arrest of Mosquito became an object of importance, and Colonel Arthur, then governor, offered a reward for his capture. Teague, an Aboriginal boy, brought up by Dr. Luttrell, was dispatched with 2 constables. They overtook Mosquito at Oyster Bay. He resisted, but was shot in the groin, and being unarmed was captured, with 2 women, and conveyed to Hobart Town. It was resolved to bring him to justice. By the care of Dr. Scott, he was cured and transferred from the hospital to jail. Black Tom was subsequently taken, and both were tried for the murder of William Hollyhoke and Patrick Martha. Of the last. Of these offences the Tasmanian was found guilty, but Mosquito was convicted of both. Marmoa, an Otaheitean, was killed with Hollyhoke. Mosquito had lingered in their neighbourhood and watched their movements for days. He had visited their hut and received provisions from their hands. But on the morning of the murder, he purloined the guns and removed the dogs. Momoa fell instantly, but the Englishman endured the misery of long pursuit and several wounds and dropped at last, pierced through and through with spears. A murder ascribed to Black Tom, for which he was not put on trial, displayed extraordinary perfidy. This black went to the residence of Mr. Osborne of Jericho, demanding bread. His appearance excited great alarm. Mrs. Osborne was there alone. He, however, left her uninjured. Next morning her husband ran into the house, exclaiming, "The hill is covered with savages." He stood at the door on guard and endeavoured to soothe them. "What do you want? Are you hungry?" "Yes, white man," said Tom. Mrs. Osborne requested them to put down their spears. Tom consented. If the gun were laid aside, this was done. On returning the second time with food, Osborne missed his musket and then said, "I am a dead man." 2 blacks came forward, and as if in friendship, each took him by the hand. At that moment, a savage behind him thrust a spear through his back. He uttered a loud shriek, sprang convulsively forward, and fell dead. Such were the men who, in February 1825, suffered death with 6 European criminals. They were unassisted by counsel, and perhaps the evidence was not fully understood by them. It is useless, however, to extenuate their treachery, and their execution, whether politic or not, can scarcely be accounted unjust. But unhappily, these deeds of barbarity were not left to the vengeance of the law. The colonists of higher grades preserved the distinction between the guilty and the innocent, which it is the object of public trials to establish. But the lower orders, and especially the dissolute and the worthless, justified hatred to the race, and finally systematic massacre by the individual acts of such men as Mosquito. It is instructive, if not amusing, to observe how nicely the theory of some philosophers and the sentiments of the lowest European robbers meet together. How, what one predicts, the other executes. The supposed eternal laws of nature are accomplished by the wild license of an English savage. It became the serious conviction of stockmen that blacks are brutes, only of a more cunning and dangerous order, an impression which has long ceased in this colony, but which still flourishes in Australia Felix. Bent, the proprietor of the only newspaper published at that time, referring to the outrages of the hostile blacks, seemed to dread these doctrines. With great consideration, he detaches Mosquito's guilt from the tribes in general, a distinction by no means trite or universally recognized. Until corrupted by the Sydney natives they were, he asserts, the most peaceable race in existence. These suggestions deserve more praise than the highest literary skill. The disposition to conciliate the blacks eventually contributed to the same disastrous consequences. A tribe of 60 appeared in Hobart Town in November 1824. They came in a peaceable manner, their visit was unexpected, and its cause unknown. On the first notice of their approach, the governor went forth to meet them. He assigned 3 places for their fires, supplied them with food and blankets, and appointed constables to protect them. They departed suddenly, and on their journey attempted to spear a white man. Whether the abrupt retreat resulted from caprice or distrust, it did not prevent a similar visit to Launceston in the following December. There were 200 in this party. When crossing Patterson's Plains, they were wantonly fired on by the whites, and in their return some of their women were treated with indescribable brutality. When they reached the Lake River, 2 sawyers, who had never before suffered molestation, were wounded by their spears. The recent cruelty they had experienced fully accounted for their rage. It was the anxious desire of the governor to establish a native institution, deriving its funds partly from the public purse, and partly from private benevolence. A code was prepared by the Reverend Messrs. Bedford and Mansfield, and a public meeting held in the Church of St. David, the governor presiding, approved the regulations. But at that time the colony was distracted by the ravages of robbers, and its financial resources were depressed, and the prevailing opinion that civilization was impossible still further embarrassed the project and confined the hopes of the most sanguine to the rising generation. Mr. Mansfield rested his expectation rather on the power of God than upon human probabilities. The civilization of a barbarous people is perhaps impossible in the presence of organized communities of white men. The contrast is too great, and the points of contact too numerous and irritating. Never have colonists civilized Aborigines, but the failure is easily explained, without recourse to egotistical superstition, that the white man's shadow is, to men of every other hue, by law of heaven, the shadow of death. The children of Aborigines, adopted by the whites when they grew to maturity, were drawn to the woods, and resumed the habits of their kindred. A black girl, trained in Launceston, thus allured, laid aside her clothing, which she had worn nearly from infancy. It was thus, with many, a sense of inferiority to the youth about them, united with the mysterious interest which every heart feels in kindred sympathies, is sufficient to account for these relapses. Examples will crowd upon the memory of the reader in which the polish and caresses of the British capital did not disqualify the savage to re-enter with zest on the barbarous pursuits of his forefathers. The desire for sugar, bread, and blankets could only be regularly gratified by an abandonment of migratory habits. When remote from the government stores, the natives still coveted what they could not obtain but as spoil. They had learned to prefer articles of steel to the crystal, and they acquired an imperfect mastery of firearms. Some were, however, exceedingly expert. A chief, conciliated by Robinson, brought down an eagle hawk, with all the airs of a practiced sportsman. Thus, their untutored nature could not resist the temptation created by new wants. They watched the hut of the stockkeeper, which they stripped during his absence, till, growing more daring, they disregarded his presence. And even the populous districts and establishments of considerable force were not safe from their depredations. At the time when they first became formidable, armed bushrangers scoured the colony, sometimes the allies of the natives, much oftener their oppressors. Outlaws themselves, they inculcated the arts of violence. The improved caution and cunning of the natives, so often noticed by the government, were ascribed in no small degree to the treacherous lessons of degraded Europeans. But when the bushranger did not employ these people as the instrument of his designs, by fear or cruelty, often he destroyed them. Thus, Lemon and Brown set up the natives as marks to fire at. The irritated savage confounded the armed, though unoffending stockkeeper with his marauding countrymen, and missing the object of his premeditated vengeance, speared the first substitute he encountered. This conclusion is amply supported by facts. The common principles which affect the minds of nations towards each other, the reprisals which are vindicated in civilized war, only differ in circumstance. 1,000 injuries, never recorded, if stated in a connection with these results, would enable us to see how often the harmless settler was sacrificed to passions, provoked by his robber countrymen. In 1826, a remarkable instance was brought under the notice of government. Dunn, who at length met the punishment he deserved, seized a woman and forced her to the hut of Mr. Thompson on the Shannon, where he detained her with violence. She, however, escaped to her people and roused them to avenge her. Dunn, next morning, suddenly found himself in their midst. His musket protected him, and after hours of such torture as his conscience and fears might inflict, he managed to get off. On the following day, the woman led her tribe, vociferating threats, to the hut in which she had been maltreated, where they massacred James Scott, a man with whom they had lived in friendship for many years, and who, when warned a few days before to be on his guard, smiled at the notion of danger. The treatment of some of these women was such as no one can be expected to credit until prepared by extensive acquaintance with human deprivation. A monster boasted that having captured a native woman whose husband he had killed, he strung the bleeding head to her neck and drove her before him as his prize. Had not this fact been guaranteed by formal inquiry, it could only have been admitted as a specimen of brutal gasconade, and in proof of how much a cruel fancy could exceed the actual guilt of mankind. It sometimes happened that an unfortunate servant would receive the spear intended for his predecessor in the same employ, to whom it was justly due. Among the whites there were men distinguished for the malicious vigor with which they tracked and murdered the native people. A lad, on his arrival from England, was sent into the interior and warned never to wander from his dwelling, but he forgot the danger he did not see, and straying a short distance, he was murdered. He had never injured his destroyers, but then he lived on the lands just, before in charge of a villain, and who, like a Roman warrior, took his name of Abyssinian Tom from the locality of his exploits. The infliction of judicial punishments interrupted the friendly intercourse of the tribe that visited Hobart Town and who were encouraged to resort to Kangaroo Point, where huts were erected for their use. The arrest of 2 of their number filled them with apprehension. The Aborigines, Jack and Dick, were executed on the 16th of September, 1826, an event which terminated all present hope of amicable relations. The murder of a shepherd at Oyster Bay, Great Swan Port, was proved against them by the evidence of convict stockkeepers, a topic of contemporary complaint. But the courts regularly relied on the same class of witnesses, and in this case there is no special reason for suspicion. The fact was not questioned. The culprits had been treated with kindness by the government, and efforts had been made by Colonel Arthur to acquaint them with the obligations of British subjects. He asserts that by personal interviews he was fully convinced that they understood the benevolent views of the Crown. One of these blacks was so far civilized as to be admitted to the sacrament of the English Church. His companion was a youth and denied his guilt. The old black was carried to the scaffold and resisted the execution. The younger disentangled his arms and struggled for his life. It was indeed a melancholy spectacle. Successive governors had witnessed crimes against their race, atrocious and unpunished. Hundreds had fallen unavenged by that public justice which treated them as murderers. On the day of their execution, the governor addressed the colony. He vindicated this act of severity as requisite to intimidate the blacks, but he solemnly pledged his government to equal justices, and that the law should take its course on individuals of either race who might violate the common law of mankind. The discussions which followed proved the division of public opinion on the propriety of this measure. It was not clear to many that the natives were legally accountable, or that their punishment was just. Grotius and Vattel were quoted. Writers who have discoursed upon the relations of man and distinguished the felon from the enemy. It was, however, simply a question between judicial and private vengeance. The interference of the court could alone prevent a general proscription. In the heat of anger, no provocation would be weighed, no palliative admitted, and the innocent would perish with the guilty. The impression on the Aborigines was unfavorable. They saw only the death of an unfortunate countryman, and perhaps the last act of the white man's warfare. Its moral influence was not great on either race. It neither softened the resentment of the British nor intimidated the blacks. It was a mere variety in the forms of destruction. The brother of one of these men led the Oyster Bay tribe and prompted the murders which, in 1830, filled the colony with wailing. The rapid colonization of the island from 1821 to 1824 and the diffusion of settlers and servants through districts hitherto unlocated added to the irritation of the natives and multiplied the agents of destruction. Land unfenced and flocks and herds moving on hill and dale left the motions of the native hunters free, but hedges and homesteads were signals which even the least rationality could not fail to understand, and on every reappearance the natives found some favorite spot surrounded by new enclosures, and no longer theirs. The proclamations of the government assumed the fixed relations of the different tribes to particular districts. Oyster Bay and the Big River were deemed sufficiently precise definitions of those tribes, exposed to public jealousy and prosecution. It is true, they had no permanent villages, and accordingly no individual property in land, but the boundaries of each horde were known, and trespass was a declaration of war. The English of modern times will not comprehend joint ownership, notwithstanding the once common property of the nation has been only lately distributed by law. The rights of the Aborigines were never recognized by the Crown. Yet it is not less certain that they saw with intelligence the progress of occupation and felt that the gradual alienation of their hunting grounds implied their expulsion and extinction. Native topography is, indeed, limited, but it is exact. Every mountain, valley, and river is distinguished and named. The English have often been indebted to these primitive surveyors for guidance through the forests which they came to divide. The tribes took up their periodical stations and moved with intervals so regular that their migrations were anticipated, as well as the season of their return. The person employed in their pursuit, by the aid of his native allies, was able to predict at what period and place he should find a tribe, the object of his mission. And though months intervened, he found them in the valley, and at the time he had foretold. Expectations of this sort could only be justified by the regularity of their movements and the exact knowledge of the guides. Nor were they indifferent to the charms of a native land. A visitor inquired of a native woman at Flinders whether she preferred that place to several others mentioned, where she had lived at times, and she answered with indifference. But when, to test her attachment to her early haunts, the querist said, "And not Ringarooma," she exclaimed with touching animation, "Oh yes, Ringarooma, Ringarooma." A chief accompanied the commandant to Launceston in 1847. At his own earnest request, he was taken to see the cataract basin of the South Esk, a river which foams and dashes through a narrow channel of precipitous rocks until a wider space affords it tranquility. It was a station of his people, precisely the kind of spot which gypsies, on the business of Egypt, would choose for their tents. As he drew nigh, his excitement was intense. He leaped from rock to rock, with the gestures and exclamations of delight. So powerful were his emotions that the lad with him became alarmed, lest the associations of the scene should destroy the discipline of 12 years' exile. But the woods were silent. He heard no voice save his own, and he returned pensively with his young companion. These examples show that the native was not an indifferent spectator of that rapid occupation which must have appeared prodigious to scattered tribes. A further cause of exasperation, consequent on the preceding, was the destruction of game. The extent to which it was carried was enormous. The skin of the kangaroo, sold for a few pence, was the perquisite of the stock-keepers, and long the chief object of their daily enterprise. Their rugs, their clothing, were composed often of these spoils, and the pursuit did not slacken until the persecuted animal retired. Geoffrey, describing the field sports of his day, 1810, tells us that flocks of emu and kangaroo were found at short intervals, and that a cart might be loaded with their flesh by the sport of a morning. But he remained long enough to observe a sensible diminution and proposed limitations by law to the havoc of the whites, an idea subsequently entertained by the Aborigines Committee, which sat in 1830. The dogs, trained to hunt the kangaroo, were at first serviceable to the natives, but they often increased the destruction by their spontaneous ravening. It is observed by a writer of 1827 that 40 or 50 would be found within short distances, run down by the dogs, and left to rot. Thus the food, on which the people depended for subsistence, was diminished, and the temptation to rob the settlers was regularly augmented at every return. Sir George Arthur, in his letter to the Secretary of State in 1828, notices this topic as a complaint of the natives against the intrusion of the whites, and seems to admit its truth. But 3 years after, he affirms that game was still abundant in the districts appointed for the tribes. It is, however, to be observed that he wrote when the blacks, as a people, were dead, and when the high value of labour had withdrawn many from the chase, and that he implies a local, rather than a pervading abundance. As the natives passed through the settled districts to the seashore, if numerous, their requirements would be great. But by scattering themselves abroad to obtain a sufficiency, their dangers would increase, and every evening they would muster fewer than in the morning. Among the causes of enmity, referred to by writers of every period, the abduction of the women by sealers and others is noticed the earliest and continued to the last. The sealers were, chiefly, either convicts whose sentences had expired or such as contrived to escape. In the islands of the Straits, they indulged the boundless license of their passions, blending the professions of the petty pirate and the fisherman. A chain of rocks enabled them to rove to a considerable distance, picking up the refuse of the sea and feeding on the aquatic birds which frequented the islets in great abundance. Many, however, perished, with the frail boats to which they committed their lives. Their first stage was known as Clark's Island. From thence they made Preservation Island. A succession of rocks formed landmarks in their course to New Holland, from which many found their way to Kangaroo Island, the Ultima Thule of their geography. In these places they engaged in sealing, the produce of which they sold to the small craft trading among them for guns, spirits, and tobacco. When the season was over, they retired to the interior and passed their days in alternate slumber and intoxication. So secure were some of these retreats that they justified the apprehension that formidable pirates would be trained up in their lawless and licentious communities. They were perpetually disturbed by violence. One old man spent 13 years on an island, alone. He cultivated a plot of ground and sold the produce to the boats which floated about. Several times robbed of his crops and clothing by these contemptible spoilers, he, at last, was compelled to renounce his rude independence. In King's Island, families sat down, but Colonel Arthur, sensible of the great danger of these associations, sent the harbour master to the Straits, who arrested absconders and released native women from slavery. By these men, the black women and female children were captured in excursions to this island, and were liable to the ill treatment which might be expected from men who regarded them with passion and contempt. They were employed as slaves on some islands to strip the mutton bird and in whatever irksome labour was within their capacity. It is said that one man, Harrison, had 14 women in his service, whom he flogged with military severity and some of whom he put to death. Boatswain, an aged woman, stolen in her youth, related the manner of her abduction. She was induced to enter a boat without suspicion of the design when her captors rowed away and confined her on an island in the Straits. She told her treatment in broken English and expressive pantomime, first spreading forth her hands as if fastened to the wall, then, with loud cries, gradually becoming fainter, she fell down into a pretended swoon, thus describing the mode and severity of her torture. These men acquired an extraordinary dominion over the fears of the women, sufficient to induce them to dissemble in the presence of strangers. Backhouse relates that 2 girls, Jumbo and Jackie, pretended, while in the company of their masters, either by silence or feigned anger, to resent the proposal to take them away. But when they were assured that their liberty would be protected, they embraced it with joy. Jeffreys, whose narrative is tinged with romance, depicts the fondness and contentment of the women in lively colours. Glad to escape the tyranny of their countrymen, they displayed to these amiable white men warm, though jealous, affection, whose occasional absence they regretted, and for whose speedy return they invoked some imaginary deity in plaintive melodies. It is not improbable that they were sensible of kindness, but it is very certain that this was not their ordinary lot. Unanimous testimony permits no doubt that they experienced the severity which men of low intellect and of fierce and capricious passions inflict on women of an inferior race. The sealers, when they came to the mainland, rarely brought their captives. They were in danger of losing them. Their fickleness or revenge was sometimes fatal. In 1824, a party engaged in an expedition to entice the girls of a tribe took with them one who had a half-caste infant and sent her on shore as a decoy. She returned, bringing promises from her countrywomen to appear the following day. But at that time the blacks descended in great force, and all the adventurers, except one, were slain. The sealers, by the names they gave the women, which were rarely feminine and were sometimes ludicrously absurd, indicated the notions which prevailed. However slight their apparent importance, it has been justly observed, they betray the low civilization of the persons who invented, and the degraded condition of those who bore them. The intercourse of the stockmen was generally confined to the periods of migration, sometimes with the connivance, at others the express consent of the men, but the detention was often compulsory. Dr. Ross found a stockkeeper seated on a fallen tree, exhausted with hunger. He had chained a woman to a log to tame her, but she escaped with his only shirt, which he had bestowed in his fondness. For 5 hours he had pursued her, catching glimpses of his shirt through the brakes of the forest. At last, this signal disappeared, and having lost his way for 2 days, he was in danger of starvation. Such were the various causes which combined first to alarm and then to goad into madness this unhappy people. They were troublesome and were repelled. Wantonly wounded and shot down, they retaliated. Fresh wrongs produced their kind. At length every white man was a guerrilla, and every black an assassin. The original temper of both parties was changed. Dread, detestation, and treachery embittered every mind. Even the humane yielded to the general sentiment. It became a question which race should perish, and every man's verdict was in favor of his own. From this, however, it is not to be inferred that the natives were originally treacherous and cruel. It was stated by the Aborigines Committee in the middle of the conflict that such dispositions were the substratum of their character, which, though disguised, only waited for time and opportunity. The colonists in general, at last, believed them to delight in blood by an innate cruelty of temper, to find pleasure in the terrors they excited and the convulsive agonies of the dying. But the records of mankind are full of such moral transformations. The Indians of America, we are informed by Dr. Dwight, became corrupt to a degree enormous and dreadful, full of malice, cruelty, and murders. But he himself elsewhere remarks that within his observation, white men commonly sober, moral, and orderly, on joining a mob, lost every one of these qualities, and in a few hours of excitement exhibited more vice than he had witnessed for years. The causes of degeneracy are not examined when its mischief is suffered. Sir George Arthur, in his dispatches, asserted that the natives were, and had been, a most treacherous race, a view which the committee adopted. These opinions were afterwards greatly modified, nor would it be just to admit their truth without stronger evidence than history affords. Among the Aborigines, some were distinguished for ferocity. Such was a woman who led on the Big River tribe and who was called by Mr. Robinson the Amazon. A few were guilty of the crimes imputed to the race, and who were often their oppressors rather than their avengers. Though individuals undoubtedly displayed the vices imputed, who will condemn the natural disposition of a people for actions committed at lone intervals, by solitary assassins and marauders? The English alone could preserve a record of the past, and after a careful examination, no other conclusion is possible than that whoever continued acts of ferocity and cruelty, the impulse and the example were European. Dr. Ross, arriving in 1822, passed into the interior and settled on a farm. He was soon visited by the natives, whom he entertained with the consideration due to their ignorance and their rights. They had kindled their fires in perilous contiguity, and the flames threatened to destroy his crops. He pointed out his danger, and they instantly combined to extinguish the flame and transferred their temporary resting place to a spot from which no harm could be communicated. Dr. Ross stood by and watched their cookery, and they offered him a part of their food. He suffered himself to be amused with their loud merriment and their evolutions in the water. They often renewed their visits and rather contributed to his safety by assisting in the pursuit of white robbers. And even when they inflicted dreadful outrages on many others, provoked by extraordinary male treatment, they still preserved their kindness for this amiable man, until they were finally removed to Flinders Island. These incidents were not uncommon. The cross-lights, which seem to exhibit variously the character of a race, but in reality identify the family of man. To judge of a people during a season of extraordinary excitement must tend to erroneous conclusions. Thus, when we turn to contemporary writings, we are amazed at the ferocity of expression, the sweeping and sanguinary appeals by which they are disfigured. But this astonishment is corrected when we examine the incidents they record, and recollect how little qualified men are to reason when they are doomed to suffer. So with the native, the delirium of rage and the taste for blood had been produced by causes of long operation, and he appeared to be a fiend full of mischief and spite, marked out by his crimes for utter extinction. Footnotes: the ruffians who maltreated them were indeed punished with 25 lashes. Whether from policy or humanity, Michael Howe formed an exception. He did not allow them to be molested, except in battle, and he flogged with the cat one of his comrades, who had broken the articles by wantonly wounding a native. In sentencing Roger at Port Phillip, 1842, Judge Willis told him that he had been tried by an intelligent jury, that he could have challenged any of them, that to say he had never been in a court of justice before was a common plea with white malefactors, and that he knew as much on the subject as many immigrants. When he was sentenced, the Rev. Mr. Hurst explained to him that he would be hanged. This was requisite, as the judge's address was utterly unintelligible. The natives are tenacious of their hunting grounds, as the settlers are of their farms, and are displeased when they find houses upon them. This caused the attack of livestock and huts. R. O'Connor, Esquire. It was a great oversight that a treaty was not made with the natives. That feeling of injustice, which I am persuaded they have always entertained, would have then had no existence. Sir George Arthur's Dispatch to Lord Glenelg, 1835. The extension of the settled districts upon their usual hunting grounds has either driven them entirely from them or removed the kangaroo. They are quite disappointed of their usual supplies. We have never known them to eat the flesh of either sheep or cattle. Courier, 1830. The extent of their consumption might be inferred from the increase after their exit. To preserve their crops, some settlers were obliged to employ hunters. In 1831, from Bothwell only, 100,000 skins were sent to Hobart Town, bearing a value of £2,000. End of chapter 44, being the Aborigines, section 3.